it reminds me, actually, I had this slightly trollish, if I'm honest, like theory, which is that a lot of people actually have gender dysphoria, but like mild gender. So the radical feminist version of this is to say, women, of course women don't want to be like pornified sex objects. Of course teenage girls or anyone would experience sort of dysphoria at that and might explain that by identifying as non-binary or something like that. I think that's true, but I'd go beyond that, like thinking about, I don't know, like little boys having to sit still in the classroom when they want to be running around outside, or really anyone, like, or men not being able to do like physical work that they would historically have done, or women not starting families until really late in life when they're like their broodiness is kicked in much earlier. Like there's actually loads of ways in which people don't get to behave instinctively according to their like gendered instincts in modern life, which causes people, it's not like real gender dysphoria, it's not like, that's why I say I'm being a bit of a troll, it's not like it causes people anguish, but it does cause people, I think, mild distress. And we don't tend to talk about it because partly because of the ideology that expects modern people to be very gender egalitarian, and to not be drawn to instinctively different gender behaviors.
Yeah, I guess people like me really benefit from the way society is currently set up because I have no maternal instinct and I am naturally a gender non-conforming person, which is one of the reasons I am glad to be 40 years old and not 20 years old, because I think if I were who I am, but much younger, I probably would be, asking people for money to pay for my top surgery at this point.
Do you think, or do you not think that you're so, I don't know if contrarian is unfair, but like you're such an independent thinker that you would never have fallen for it? No, or do you think it was just like a matter of which decade you were born in?
I think it depends on when, in like this hypothetical scenario, when I'm younger than I am, because there would have been a point in which it wasn't so cool to do this that I probably, when it was still like I have tattoos, I got tattoos when I was 20. I don't think I would get tattoos now because tattoos is sort of a normie basic thing to do. But there probably would have been a tipping point if the timing had aligned correctly, in which case it would have been just sort of iconoclastic enough to transition that I would have done it. But I also, I've as I have aged, I have become more comfortable being sort of in the out group. And in my 20s, I was certainly not as comfortable. Social stuff was much more important to me. I cared about being popular and cool, and I was, for the record, no longer. So I think I probably, and if I was a lot younger, I mean, I did have, according to sort of the WPATH dictionary definition of gender dysphoria, I probably would have qualified for a diagnosis. Very gender nonconforming from a young age. I'm a twin and my sister was girly. I was the opposite. Hated wearing dresses. Always played with, I was the only girl on my baseball team. Going through puberty was intensely distressing, although it is for many, many girls. That doesn't mean I needed to be a boy. And I think the real irony is that the thing that made me eventually sort of embrace being a woman, embrace my femaleness, was going through puberty, coming out the other side, having essentially a sexual awakening and realizing that I was a lesbian. And once I realized that, all of these things make sense, right? And if I hadn't gone through puberty, if I had been taking puberty blockers, that wouldn't have happened. And so I think there is this real irony that the thing that is so painful for gender dysphoric children, puberty, and for me, like getting my period for the first time was a really, really terrible experience. It felt shameful, not just physically painful, but really shameful. But if you don't go through that experience, you don't emerge into adulthood. You don't mature in these other ways that make you sort of realize your own sexual identity. And I think that's probably happening to some kids. They're so uncomfortable with it. And there's this way to stop this thing that they don't want to happen from happening. But if I hadn't done that, if I had just transitioned into a male, I mean, I don't know, things would be very different.
You would still have you have a lot of problems. I mean, you mentioned Buck Angel, right? Buck has some pretty bad health problems, right? I can't remember all the details, but I think he's spoken about having like uterine
atrophy. So Buck did almost die, but he transitioned 30 years ago. I think his doctors told him, like, literally said, you were a guinea pig. And so if you take testosterone for long enough, you can have vaginal atrophy, and your uterus, I don't know the mechanism here, but your uterus, something bad happens to the uterus. So now,
like, closes over,
something
kind
like
of.
that. So now,
to put it in layman's terms,
right? So trans men now, it's not uncommon for trans men to have hysterectomies. And there are things that you can do. I think there are like vaginal topicals that you can use to help prevent vaginal atrophy and stuff like that. So, but when Buck started, this was basically unknown medicine. So I think he had to have an emergency hysterectomy. I don't know, beyond that, I don't know about any particular health problems. I mean, it would not surprise me. Our bodies are not designed to have cross-sex hormones in them. They are not. And there's a lot of people who've been experimenting with this. Maybe it will be worth it for some of them. I do wonder, I've heard stories about, I don't know how widespread this is, but I've heard stories about, as the trans population ages and gets dementia, that it can be a very sort of, you look in the mirror, you're 80 years old, you look in the mirror and you see a woman, but you know that you were born a man, can be this sort of really distressing experience. But
that's really dystopian.
Yeah. I mean, you said something a little while ago about in a few decades, when this craze has ended. And I think you're right. I think for sure the craze will end and will sort of restabilize, and men will be men and women will be women again, or males will be males and females will be females again. The trend will end. But I also don't think that trans people are going to disappear, because trans people existed. This is one of the things that activists chant. Trans people have always existed, blah, blah, blah. But it's actually true. People were getting sex changes in the when was Christine Jorgensen in the 1920s or 30s or 40s? I can't remember.
Like 19, yeah.
Yeah. So,
1930s, I
30s,
think.
yeah. So it's not as though this emerged in the past 20 years from nothing. There have been, and there, at least for the last 100 years, there have been, and I think there probably always will be, people who are just so uncomfortable with their bodies, whether it's a paraphilia or gender dysphoria, or it's because of social expectations, who just really cannot stand being the sex that they were born. I don't think that's going to go away. I just think those people are rare.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. I think that well, there are kind of two populations we're talking about, right? One is the people who are very gender non-conforming from childhood and who are often gay and lesbian. They clearly do crop up cross-culturally, and different cultures have different ways of like wrapping their heads around them. And there are often like, it's more common, right, to have the feminine men having some sort of third gender thing, which doesn't involve doing anything medical, because obviously in most cultures you can't do anything medical, but does involve like different social roles. The autogynephiles, though, are a more difficult group because it's really not clear. There clearly are lots of historical examples. Well, there are some historical examples of men clearly being extremely into cross-dressing in private. Do you remember a little while ago, I can't remember the name of this guy now, but there was a photographer who lived and worked in LA, who had done who was quite like an acclaimed photographer for doing like something completely boring like travel or fashion or something. And he died, and in his possessions were found loads of photos of him cross-dressing, like dressing up in like maids' outfits and things like this. So obviously a sex thing. And like a glossy coffee table book of his nudes were published. I shouldn't laugh.
After he died?
After he died, without his consent.
Wow.
Right? This was clearly like a private sex thing, which he had never spoken about in public. And now he's a trans hero. Whatever, his relatives gave permission. Yeah, and it got like a glowing review in the New Yorker as this like brave, beautiful, whatever. And I was like, this is this guy's nudes.
Oh, God.
You've just put in anyway, but like clearly historically there are examples of
yes.
Guys being into cross-dressing. And now they're more likely to end up on the road that ends with transition.
Totally.
And I honestly don't think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think it's really unlikely that that's a good thing for them, because it makes it so, it just makes life really hard. Like
most
so
of
much
them are
harder.
not going to pass.
And
I mean, and like, I think that's
of course.
And this is something that doesn't get, I think, talked about as much as it should. But, you know, for all of the discourse about privilege, white privilege, cis privilege, whatever, male privilege, passing privilege, beauty privilege is a real privilege in society, probably in every society that has existed or will existed. And the way that you are treated as a man who even if we wanted to live in sort of the like ideal gender critical society where everybody's like everybody wears overalls and is sort of sexless or whatever, you can't tell what people are. That's not the society that we live in. And if you are essentially what looks like a man in a dress, society, except in very narrow circumstances within whatever queer community you live in, is going to look down upon you. I have a friend who is AGP, has been AGP since a very young age. His sexual development, his young sexual development from the age of 5, sort of latched on to like women's stuff. And he's a freak, he's a kinkster, he's a pervert, and he is very open about this publicly. But he does it in a way, he does not, so he goes to sex parties, he wears he cross-dresses on certain occasions, everybody knows about it, but he doesn't pretend to be a woman. He doesn't pretend to be female. And so he can compartmentalize in this way that I find just much healthier. You know, he works in the trades. Like, you want to be a dude who goes, he's not a plumber, but let's just say he was a plumber. You're going to be a plumber. You're going to show up dressing like looking like a man in a wig. Like, it's going to be harder to find clients. It's just, and maybe that's not maybe we should live in a society where you can wear whatever you want and there should be no repercussions, and men can wear heels and dresses and women can wear whatever. And women can, I think, pretty much wear whatever they want. Society's much more forgiving of women when it comes to gender nonconformity, but we don't live in that society. And you can aspire to that, but we don't live in it. And we're probably, frankly, never going to live in it. So, yeah, I mean, this idea that the appropriate response to having a paraphilia like AGP, or having a kink, is to live it full time. I find it bizarre also because none of us should be, this maybe sounds a little bit too prescriptive, but in general, our sexualities are a part of our lives. They are not our entire lives, right? So to me, the idea that like making your kink your full-time identity, doesn't that take kind of the fun out of it? I don't know.
The sex negative case for sex positivity. Andrea Longchu has a very good line about this, even though I'm sure Andrea Longchu would be really appalled to hear me quoting their work. But I honestly think Andrea Longchu is a really good writer.
Great writer.
The line is, when you transition, I'm probably mangling it, you become permanently dependent on the kindness of strangers, in the sense that you are constantly dependent on people recognizing that you're trans and being nice about it.
That is very self-aware.
Right. I mean, that's what's so interesting about Andrea Longchu's work. There's like simultaneous incredible levels of self-awareness and also incredible levels of self-deception, like ricocheting between the two. But yes, like not everyone is going to play along, and not necessarily because they're mean. It might be because they're like a child, or an adult with dementia,
or they just live in a normal society
or something.
Right. I mean, that's my
right,
wife,
and they don't get it.
My wife is a nurse, and she works in a very diverse hospital. And I don't mean diverse like everybody has purple hair and votes the same way. I mean actually diverse. Lots of immigrants who work there, but this is also in Seattle, so a city where the sort of administrative line is that very inclusive, ask people their pronouns even if it makes them uncomfortable, that kind of thing. And for immigrants who have not grown up in this sort of decadent Western liberal culture where gender is a fiction or whatever, and you can be whatever you want, this is very confusing to them. And for some immigrants, there's a lot of Filipino immigrants at our hospital, in their language, Tagalog or whatever it's called, they don't have gendered pronouns. And so they're constantly messing people's pronouns up in English, not because they're intentionally doing it, but because they don't use gendered pronouns in their language. It's just a different language. And so for trans people, this can be very insulting for them. For some of them, it's traumatic. And so my wife has seen cases where her immigrant colleagues who are coming to the United States, oftentimes without much money, they're immigrants, are getting in trouble at work for making these absolute minor unintentional errors because of the sensitivities of trans Westerners, basically.